Chapter 15 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 15. The burden whereof is Hail Columbia. A dark and dreary night. People nestling in their beds or circling late about the fire. Want, colder than charity, shivering at the street corners. Church towers humming with the faint vibration of their own tongues, but newly resting from the ghostly preachment one. The earth covered with a sable pall as for the burial of yesterday. The clumps of dark trees, its giant plumes of funeral feathers waving sadly to and fro, all hushed, all noiseless, and in deep repose, save the swift clouds that skim across the moon, and the cautious wind, as, creeping after them upon the ground, it stops to listen, and goes rustling on, and stops again and follows, like a savage on the trail. Whither go the clouds and wind so eagerly? If, like guilty spirits, they repair to some dread conference with powers like themselves, in what wild regions do the elements hold council, or where unbend in terrible disport? Here, free from that cramped prison called the earth, and out upon the waste of waters. Here, roaring, raging, shrieking, howling all night long, hither come the sounding voices from the caverns on the coast of that small island, sleeping 1,000 miles away, so quietly in the midst of angry waves, and hither to meet them rush the blasts from unknown desert places of the world. Here, in the fury of their unchecked liberty, they storm and buffet with each other, until the sea, lashed into passion like their own, leaps up, in ravings mightier than theirs, and the whole scene is madness. On, over the countless miles of angry space roll the long heaving billows. Mountains and caves are here, and yet are not, for what is now the one is now the other. Then all is but a boiling heap of rushing water, pursuit and flight and mad return of wave on wave, and savage struggle, ending in a spouting up of foam that whitens the black night. Incessant change of place and form and hue, constancy in nothing but eternal strife. On they roll, and darker grows the night, and louder howls the wind, and more clamorous and fierce become the million voices in the sea, when the wild cry goes forth upon the storm, "A ship!" Onward she comes, in gallant combat with the elements, her tall masts trembling, and her timbers starting on the strain. Onward she comes, now high upon the curling billows, now low down in the hollows of the sea, as hiding for the moment from its fury, and every storm voice in the air and water cries more loudly yet, "A ship!" Still she comes striving on, and at her boldness and the spreading cry, the angry waves rise up above each other's hoary heads to look, and round about the vessel, far as the mariners on the decks can pierce into the gloom, they press upon her, forcing each other down, and starting up, and rushing forward from afar in dreadful curiosity. High over her they break, and round her surge and roar, and giving place to others moaningly depart, and dash themselves to fragments in their baffled anger. Still she comes onward bravely, and though the eager multitude crowd thick and fast upon her all the night, and dawn of day discovers the untiring train, yet bearing down upon the ship in an eternity of troubled water, onward she comes, with dim lights burning in her hull, and people there asleep, as if no deadly element were peering in at every seam and chink, and no drowned seaman's grave with but a plank to cover it were yawning in the unfathomable depths below. Among these sleeping voyagers were Martin and Mark Tapley, who, rocked into a heavy drowsiness by the unaccustomed motion, were as insensible to the foul air in which they lay as to the uproar without. It was broad day when the latter awoke with a dim idea that he was dreaming of having gone to sleep in a 4-post bedstead which had turned bottom upwards in the course of the night. There was more reason in this, too, than in the roasting of eggs, for the first objects Mr. Tapley recognized when he opened his eyes were his own heels, looking down to him, as he afterwards observed, from a nearly perpendicular elevation. "Well," said Mark, getting himself into a sitting posture, after various ineffectual struggles with the rolling of the ship, "this is the first time as ever I stood on my head all night." "You shouldn't go to sleep upon the ground with your head to leeward, then," growled a man in one of the berths. "With my head to where?" asked Mark. The man repeated his previous sentiment. "No, I won't another time," said Mark, "when I know whereabouts on the map that country is. In the meanwhile I can give you a better piece of advice. Don't you nor any other friend of mine never go to sleep with his head in a ship any more." The man gave a grunt of discontented acquiescence, turned over in his berth, and drew his blanket over his head. "For," said Mr. Tapley, pursuing the theme by way of soliloquy in a low tone of voice, "the sea is as nonsensical a thing as any going. It never knows what to do with itself. It hasn't got no employment for its mind, and is always in a state of vacancy, like them polar bears in the wild beast shows, as is constantly a nodding their heads from side to side. It never can be quiet, which is entirely owing to its uncommon stupidity." "Is that you, Mark?" asked a faint voice from another berth. "It's as much of me as is left, sir, after a fortnight of this work," Mr. Tapley replied. "What with leading the life of a fly ever since I've been aboard, for I've been perpetually holding on to something or other in a upside down position, what with that, sir, and putting a very little into myself, and taking a good deal out of myself, there ain't too much of me to swear by. How do you find yourself this morning, sir?" "Very miserable," said Martin, with a peevish groan. "Ugh! This is wretched indeed." "Creditable," muttered Mark, pressing one hand upon his aching head, and looking round him with a rueful grin. "That's the great comfort. It is creditable to keep up one's spirits here. Virtue's its own reward. So's jollity." Mark was so far right that unquestionably any man who retained his cheerfulness among the steerage accommodations of that noble and fast sailing line of packet ship, the Screw, was solely indebted to his own resources, and shipped his good humour, like his provisions, without any contribution or assistance from the owners. A dark, low, stifling cabin, surrounded by berths, all filled to overflowing with men, women, and children, in various stages of sickness and misery, is not the liveliest place of assembly at any time. But when it is so crowded, as the steerage cabin of the Screw was, every passage out, that mattresses and beds are heaped upon the floor to the extinction of everything like comfort, cleanliness, and decency, it is liable to operate not only as a pretty strong banner against amiability of temper, but as a positive encourager of selfish and rough humours. Mark felt this as he sat looking about him, and his spirits rose proportionately. There were English people, Irish people, Welsh people, and Scotch people there, all with their little store of coarse food and shabby clothes, and nearly all with their families of children. There were children of all ages, from the baby at the breast to the slattern girl who was as much a grown woman as her mother. Every kind of domestic suffering that is bred in poverty, illness, banishment, sorrow, and long travel in bad weather was crammed into the little space, and yet was there infinitely less of complaint and querulousness, and infinitely more of mutual assistance and general kindness, to be found in that unwholesome ark than in many brilliant ball-rooms. Mark looked about him wistfully, and his face brightened as he looked. Here an old grandmother was crooning over a sick child, and rocking it to and fro, in arms hardly more wasted than its own young limbs. Here a poor woman with an infant in her lap mended another little creature's clothes, and quieted another who was creeping up about her from their scanty bed upon the floor. Here were old men awkwardly engaged in little household offices, wherein they would have been ridiculous but for their good will and kind purpose. And here were swarthy fellows, giants in their way, doing such little acts of tenderness for those about them as might have belonged to gentlest hearted dwarfs. The very idiot in the corner, who sat mowing there all day, had his faculty of imitation roused by what he saw about him, and snapped his fingers to amuse a crying child. "Now then," said Mark, nodding to a woman who was dressing her 3 children at no great distance from him, and the grin upon his face had by this time spread from ear to ear, "hand over one of them young uns, according to custom." "I wish you'd get breakfast, Mark, instead of worrying with people who don't belong to you," observed Martin petulantly. "All right," said Mark, "she'll do that. It's a fair division of labour, sir. I wash her boys and she makes our tea. I never could make tea, but any one can wash a boy." The woman, who was delicate and ill, felt and understood his kindness, as well she might, for she had been covered every night with his greatcoat, while he had for his own bed the bare boards and a rug. But Martin, who seldom got up or looked about him, was quite incensed by the folly of this speech, and expressed his dissatisfaction by an impatient groan. "So it is, certainly," said Mark, brushing the child's hair as coolly as if he had been born and bred a barber. "What are you talking about now?" asked Martin. "What you said," replied Mark, "or what you meant, when you gave that there dismal vent to your feelings. I quite go along with it, sir. It is very hard upon her." "What is?" "Making the voyage by herself, along with these young impediments here, and going such a way at such a time of the year to join her husband. If you don't want to be driven mad with yellow soap in your eye, young man," said Mr. Tapley to the second urchin, who was by this time under his hands at the basin, "you'd better shut it." "Where does she join her husband?" asked Martin, yawning. "Why, I'm very much afraid," said Mr. Tapley in a low voice, "that she don't know. I hope she mayn't miss him. But she sent her last letter by hand, and it don't seem to have been very clearly understood between 'em without it. And if she don't see him a waving his pocket handkerchief on the shore, like a picture out of a song book, my opinion is she'll break her heart." "Why, how in folly's name does the woman come to be on board ship on such a wild goose venture?" cried Martin. Mr. Tapley glanced at him for a moment as he lay prostrate in his berth, and then said very quietly, "Ah, how indeed, I can't think. He's been away from her for 2 year. She's been very poor and lonely in her own country, and has always been a looking forward to meeting him. It's very strange she should be here, quite amazing. A little mad, perhaps. There can't be no other way of accounting for it." Martin was too far gone in the lassitude of seasickness to make any reply to these words, or even to attend to them as they were spoken; and the subject of their discourse, returning at this crisis with some hot tea, effectually put a stop to any resumption of the theme by Mr. Tapley, who, when the meal was over and he had adjusted Martin's bed, went up on deck to wash the breakfast service, which consisted of 2 half-pint tin mugs and a shaving pot of the same metal. It is due to Mark Tapley to state that he suffered at least as much from seasickness as any man, woman, or child on board, and that he had a peculiar faculty of knocking himself about on the smallest provocation, and losing his legs at every lurch of the ship; but resolved, in his usual phrase, to come out strong under disadvantageous circumstances, he was the life and soul of the steerage, and made no more of stopping in the middle of a facetious conversation to go away and be excessively ill by himself, and afterwards come back in the very best and gayest of tempers to resume it, than if such a course of proceeding had been the commonest in the world. It cannot be said that as his illness wore off his cheerfulness and good nature increased, because they would hardly admit of augmentation; but his usefulness among the weaker members of the party was much enlarged, and at all times and seasons there he was exerting it. If a gleam of sun shone out of the dark sky, down Mark tumbled into the cabin, and presently up he came again with a woman in his arms, or 6 children, or a man, or a bed, or a saucepan, or a basket, or something animate or inanimate, that he thought would be the better for the air. If an hour or 2 of fine weather in the middle of the day tempted those who seldom or never came on deck at other times to crawl into the long boat, or lie down upon the spare spars and try to eat, there in the centre of the group was Mr. Tapley, handing about salt beef and biscuit, or dispensing tastes of grog, or cutting up the children's provisions with his pocket knife, for their greater ease and comfort, or reading aloud from a venerable newspaper, or singing some roaring old song to a select party, or writing the beginnings of letters to their friends at home for people who couldn't write, or cracking jokes with the crew, or nearly getting blown over the side, or emerging half drowned from a shower of spray, or lending a hand somewhere or other, but always doing something for the general entertainment. At night, when the cooking fire was lighted on the deck, and the driving sparks that flew among the rigging and the clouds of sails seemed to menace the ship with certain annihilation by fire, in case the elements of air and water failed to compass her destruction, there again was Mr. Tapley, with his coat off and his shirt sleeves turned up to his elbows, doing all kinds of culinary offices, compounding the strangest dishes, recognized by everyone as an established authority, and helping all parties to achieve something which, left to themselves, they never could have done, and never would have dreamed of. In short, there never was a more popular character than Mark Tapley became on board that noble and fast-sailing line of packet ship, the Screw, and he attained at last to such a pitch of universal admiration that he began to have grave doubts within himself whether a man might reasonably claim any credit for being jolly under such exciting circumstances. "If this was going to last," said Tapley, "there'd be no great difference, as I can perceive, between the Screw and the Dragon. I never am to get credit, I think. I begin to be afraid that the fates is determined to make the world easy to me." "Well, Mark," said Martin, near whose berth he had ruminated to this effect, "when will this be over?" "Another week, they say, sir," returned Mark, "will most likely bring us into port. The ship's a-going along at present as sensible as a ship can, sir, though I don't mean to say as that's any very high praise." "I don't think it is, indeed," groaned Martin. "You'd feel all the better for it, sir, if you was to turn out," observed Mark. "And be seen by the ladies and gentlemen on the after deck," returned Martin, with a scornful emphasis upon the words, "mingling with the beggarly crowd that are stowed away in this vile hole. I should be greatly the better for that, no doubt." "I'm thankful that I can't say from my own experience what the feelings of a gentleman may be," said Mark, "but I should have thought, sir, as a gentleman would feel a deal more uncomfortable down here than up in the fresh air, especially when the ladies and gentlemen in the after cabin know just as much about him as he does about them, and are likely to trouble their heads about him in the same proportion. I should have thought that, certainly." "I tell you, then," rejoined Martin, "you would have thought wrong, and do think wrong." "Very likely, sir," said Mark, with imperturbable good humour. "I often do." "As to lying here," cried Martin, raising himself on his elbow, and looking angrily at his follower, "do you suppose it's a pleasure to lie here?" "All the madhouses in the world," said Mr. Tapley, "couldn't produce such a maniac as the man must be who could think that." "Then why are you forever goading and urging me to get up?" asked Martin. "I lie here because I don't wish to be recognized, in the better days to which I aspire, by any purse-proud citizen, as the man who came over with him among the steerage passengers. I lie here because I wish to conceal my circumstances and myself, and not to arrive in a new world badged and ticketed as an utterly poverty-stricken man. If I could have afforded a passage in the after cabin, I should have held up my head with the rest. As I couldn't, I hide it. Do you understand that?" "I am very sorry, sir," said Mark. "I didn't know you took it so much to heart as this comes to." "Of course you didn't know," returned his master. "How should you know, unless I told you? It's no trial to you, Mark, to make yourself comfortable and to bustle about. It's as natural for you to do so under the circumstances as it is for me not to do so. Why, you don't suppose there is a living creature in this ship who can, by possibility, have half so much to undergo on board of her as I have, do you?" he asked, sitting upright in his berth, and looking at Mark with an expression of great earnestness, not unmixed with wonder. Mark twisted his face into a tight knot, and with his head very much on one side, pondered upon this question, as if he felt it an extremely difficult one to answer. He was relieved from his embarrassment by Martin himself, who said, as he stretched himself upon his back again, and resumed the book he had been reading, "But what is the use of my putting such a case to you, when the very essence of what I have been saying is, that you cannot by possibility understand it? Make me a little brandy and water, cold and very weak, and give me a biscuit, and tell your friend, who is a nearer neighbour of ours than I could wish, to try and keep her children a little quieter to-night than she did last night. That's a good fellow." Mr. Tapley set himself to obey these orders with great alacrity, and pending their execution, it may be presumed his flagging spirits revived, inasmuch as he several times observed, below his breath, that in respect of its power of imparting a credit to jollity, the screw unquestionably had some decided advantages over the dragon. He also remarked that it was a high gratification to him to reflect that he would carry its main excellence ashore with him, and have it constantly beside him wherever he went. But what he meant by these consolatory thoughts he did not explain. And now a general excitement began to prevail on board, and various predictions relative to the precise day, and even the precise hour at which they would reach New York, were freely broached. There was infinitely more crowding on deck, and looking over the ship's side, than there had been before, and an epidemic broke out for packing up things every morning, which required unpacking again every night. Those who had any letters to deliver, or any friends to meet, or any settled plans of going anywhere or doing anything, discussed their prospects 100 times a day, and as this class of passengers was very small, and the number of those who had no prospects whatever was very large, there were plenty of listeners and few talkers. Those who had been ill all along got well now, and those who had been well got better. An American gentleman in the after cabin, who had been wrapped up in fur and oilskin the whole passage, unexpectedly appeared in a very shiny tall black hat, and constantly overhauled a very little valise of pale leather which contained his clothes, linen, brushes, shaving apparatus, books, trinkets, and other baggage. He likewise stuck his hands deep into his pockets, and walked the deck with his nostrils dilated, as already inhaling the air of freedom which carries death to all tyrants, and can never, under any circumstances worth mentioning, be breathed by slaves. An English gentleman, who was strongly suspected of having run away from a bank with something in his possession belonging to its strong box besides the key, grew eloquent upon the subject of the rights of man, and hummed the Marseillaise hymn constantly. In a word, one great sensation pervaded the whole ship, and the soil of America lay close before them, so close at last, that upon a certain starlight night they took a pilot on board, and within a few hours afterwards lay to until the morning, awaiting the arrival of a steamboat in which the passengers were to be conveyed ashore. Off she came, soon after it was light next morning, and lying alongside an hour or more, during which period her very firemen were objects of hardly less interest and curiosity than if they had been so many angels, good or bad, took all her living freight aboard, among them Mark, who still had his friend and her 3 children under his close protection, and Martin, who had once more dressed himself in his usual attire, but wore a soiled old cloak above his ordinary clothes, until such time as he should separate forever from his late companions. The steamer, which, with its machinery on deck, looked, as it worked its long slim legs, like some enormously magnified insect or antediluvian monster, dashed at great speed up a beautiful bay, and presently they saw some heights and islands and a long, flat, straggling city. "And this," said Mr. Tapley, looking far ahead, "is the land of liberty, is it? Very well, I'm agreeable. Any land will do for me after so much water." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16, Part 1, of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 16. Martin disembarks from that noble and fast-sailing line of packet ship, the Screw, at the port of New York, in the United States of America. he makes some acquaintances, and dines at a boarding-house. The particulars of those transactions. Part 1. Some trifling excitement prevailed upon the very brink and margin of the land of liberty, for an alderman had been elected the day before, and party feeling naturally running rather high on such an exciting occasion, the friends of the disappointed candidate had found it necessary to assert the great principles of purity of election and freedom of opinion by breaking a few legs and arms, and furthermore pursuing one obnoxious gentleman through the streets with the design of hitting his nose. These good-humoured little outbursts of the popular fancy were not in themselves sufficiently remarkable to create any great stir after the lapse of a whole night, but they found fresh life and notoriety in the breath of the newsboys, who not only proclaimed them with shrill yells in all the highways and byways of the town, upon the wharves and among the shipping, but on the deck and down in the cabins of the steamboat, which, before she touched the shore, was boarded and overrun by a legion of those young citizens. "Here's this morning's New York sewer," cried one. "Here's this morning's New York stabber. Here's the New York family spy. Here's the New York private listener. Here's the New York peeper. Here's the New York plunderer. Here's the New York keyhole reporter. Here's the New York rowdy journal. Here's all the New York papers. Here's full particulars of the patriotic locofocal movement yesterday, in which the Whigs was so chawed up, and the last Alabama gouging case, and the interesting Arkansas duel with bowie knives, and all the political, commercial, and fashionable news. Here they are, here they are. Here's the papers, here's the papers." "Here's the sewer," cried another. "Here's the New York sewer. Here's some of the 12,000 of today's sewers, with the best accounts of the markets and all the shipping news, and 4 whole columns of country correspondence, and a full account of the ball at Mrs. White's last night, where all the beauty and fashion of New York was assembled, with the sewer's own particulars of the private lives of all the ladies that was there. Here's the sewer. Here's some of the 12,000 of the New York sewer. Here's the sewer's exposure of the Wall Street gang, and the sewer's exposure of the Washington gang, and the sewer's exclusive account of a flagrant act of dishonesty committed by the Secretary of State when he was 8 years old, now communicated at a great expense by his own nurse. Here's the sewer. Here's the New York sewer in its 12,000, with a whole column of New Yorkers to be shown up, and all their names printed. Here's the sewer's article upon the judge that tried him, day afore yesterday, for libel, and the sewer's tribute to the independent jury that didn't convict him, and the sewer's account of what they might have expected if they had. Here's the sewer, here's the sewer. Here's the Wide Awake sewer, always on the lookout, the leading journal of the United States, now in its 12,000, and still a printing off. Here's the New York sewer." "It is in such enlightened means," said a voice almost in Martin's ear, "that the bubbling passions of my country find a vent." Martin turned involuntarily and saw, standing close at his side, a sallow gentleman with sunken cheeks, black hair, small twinkling eyes, and a singular expression hovering about that region of his face which was not a frown nor a leer, and yet might have been mistaken at the first glance for either. Indeed, it would have been difficult, on a much closer acquaintance, to describe it in any more satisfactory terms than as a mixed expression of vulgar cunning and conceit. This gentleman wore a rather broad-brimmed hat for the greater wisdom of his appearance, and had his arms folded for the greater impressiveness of his attitude. He was somewhat shabbily dressed in a blue surtout, reaching nearly to his ankles, short loose trousers of the same colour, and a faded buff waistcoat, through which a discoloured shirt frill struggled to force itself into notice, as asserting an equality of civil rights with the other portions of his dress, and maintaining a declaration of independence on its own account. His feet, which were of unusually large proportions, were leisurely crossed before him as he half leaned against, half sat upon the steamboat's bulwark, and his thick cane, shod with a mighty ferrule at one end, and armed with a great metal knob at the other, depended from a line and tassel on his wrist. Thus attired, and thus composed into an aspect of great profundity, the gentleman twitched up the right-hand corner of his mouth and his right eye simultaneously, and said once more, It is in such enlightened means that the bubbling passions of my country find a vent." As he looked at Martin, and nobody else was by, Martin inclined his head and said, "You allude to—" "To the palladium of rational liberty at home, sir, and the dread of foreign oppression abroad," returned the gentleman, as he pointed with his cane to an uncommonly dirty newsboy with one eye. "To the envy of the world, sir, and the leaders of human civilization. Let me ask you, sir," he added, bringing the ferrule of his stick heavily upon the deck with the air of a man who must not be equivocated with, "how do you like my country?" "I am hardly prepared to answer that question yet," said Martin, "seeing that I have not been ashore." "Well, I should expect you were not prepared, sir," said the gentleman, "to behold such signs of national prosperity as those." He pointed to the vessels lying at the wharves, and then gave a vague flourish with his stick, as if he would include the air and water generally in this remark. "Really," said Martin, "I don't know. Yes, I think I was." The gentleman glanced at him with a knowing look, and said he liked his policy. It was natural, he said, and it pleased him as a philosopher to observe the prejudices of human nature. "You have brought, I see, sir," he said, turning round towards Martin, and resting his chin on the top of his stick, "the usual amount of misery and poverty and ignorance and crime to be located in the bosom of the great republic. Well, sir, let 'em come on in shiploads from the old country. When vessels are about to founder, the rats are said to leave 'em. There is considerable of truth, I find, in that remark." "The old ship will keep afloat a year or two longer yet, perhaps," said Martin with a smile, partly occasioned by what the gentleman said, and partly by his manner of saying it, which was odd enough, for he emphasized all the small words and syllables in his discourse, and left the others to take care of themselves, as if he thought the larger parts of speech could be trusted alone, but the little ones required to be constantly looked after. "Hope is said by the poet, sir," observed the gentleman, "to be the nurse of young desire." Martin signified that he had heard of the cardinal virtue in question, serving occasionally in that domestic capacity. "She will not rear her infant in the present instance, sir, you'll find," observed the gentleman. "Time will show," said Martin. The gentleman nodded his head gravely, and said, "What is your name, sir?" Martin told him. "How old are you, sir?" Martin told him. "What is your profession, sir?" Martin told him that also. "What is your destination, sir?" inquired the gentleman. "Really," said Martin, laughing, "I can't satisfy you in that particular, for I don't know it myself." "Yes?" said the gentleman. "No," said Martin. The gentleman adjusted his cane under his left arm, and took a more deliberate and complete survey of Martin than he had yet had leisure to make. When he had completed his inspection, he put out his right hand, shook Martin's hand, and said, "My name is Colonel Diver, sir. I am the editor of the New York Rowdy Journal." Martin received the communication with that degree of respect which an announcement so distinguished appeared to demand. "The New York Rowdy Journal, sir," resumed the Colonel, "is, as I expect you know, the organ of our aristocracy in this city." "Oh, there is an aristocracy here, then," said Martin. "Of what is it composed?" "Of intelligence, sir," replied the Colonel, "of intelligence and virtue, and of their necessary consequence in this republic, dollars, sir." Martin was very glad to hear this, feeling well assured that if intelligence and virtue led as a matter of course to the acquisition of dollars, he would speedily become a great capitalist. He was about to express the gratification such news afforded him, when he was interrupted by the captain of the ship, who came up at the moment to shake hands with the Colonel, and who, seeing a well-dressed stranger on the deck, for Martin had thrown aside his cloak, shook hands with him also. This was an unspeakable relief to Martin, who, in spite of the acknowledged supremacy of intelligence and virtue in that happy country, would have been deeply mortified to appear before Colonel Diver in the poor character of a steerage passenger. "Well, cap'n," said the Colonel. "Well, Colonel," cried the captain, "you're looking most uncommon bright, sir. I can hardly realize its being you, and that's a fact." "A good passage, cap'n?" inquired the Colonel, taking him aside. "Well, now, it was a pretty spanking run, sir," said, or rather sung, the captain, who was a genuine New Englander, considerin' the weather." "Yes?" said the Colonel. "Well, it was, sir," said the captain. "I've just now sent a boy up to your office with the passenger list, Colonel." "You haven't got another boy to spare, p'raps, cap'n," said the Colonel, in a tone almost amounting to severity. "I guess there air a dozen if you want 'em, Colonel," said the captain. "One moderate big 'un could convey a dozen champagne, perhaps," observed the Colonel, musing, "to my office. You said a spanking run, I think." "Well, so I did," was the reply. "It's very nigh, you know," observed the Colonel. "I'm glad it was a spanking run, cap'n. Don't mind about quarts if you're short of 'em. The boy can as well bring 24 pints and travel twice as once. A first rate spanker, cap'n, was it? Yes?" "A most etarnal spanker," said the skipper. "I admire at your good fortin, cap'n. You might loan me a corkscrew at the same time, and half a dozen glasses if you liked. However bad the elements combine against my country's noble packet ship the Screw, sir," said the Colonel, turning to Martin and drawing a flourish on the surface of the deck with his cane, "her passage either way is almost certain to eventuate a spanker." The captain, who had the sewer below at that moment, lunching expensively in one cabin, while the amiable Stabber was drinking himself into a state of blind madness in another, took a cordial leave of his friend the Colonel, and hurried away to dispatch the champagne, well knowing, as it afterwards appeared, that if he failed to conciliate the editor of the Rowdy Journal, that potentate would denounce him and his ship in large capitals before he was a day older, and would probably assault the memory of his mother also, who had not been dead more than 20 years. The Colonel, being again left alone with Martin, checked him as he was moving away, and offered, in consideration of his being an Englishman, to show him the town, and to introduce him, if such were his desire, to a genteel boarding house. But before they entered on these proceedings, he said, he would beseech the honour of his company at the office of the Rowdy Journal to partake of a bottle of champagne of his own importation. All this was so extremely kind and hospitable, that Martin, though it was quite early in the morning, readily acquiesced. So, instructing Mark, who was deeply engaged with his friend and her 3 children, that when he had done assisting them, and had cleared the baggage, he was to wait for further orders at the Rowdy Journal office, Martin accompanied his new friend on shore. They made their way as best they could through the melancholy crowd of emigrants upon the wharf, who, grouped about their beds and boxes, with the bare ground below them and the bare sky above, might have fallen from another planet for anything they knew of the country, and walked for some short distance along a busy street, bounded on one side by the quays and shipping, and on the other by a long row of staring red brick storehouses and offices, ornamented with more black boards and white letters, and more white boards and black letters, than Martin had ever seen before in 50 times the space. Presently they turned up a narrow street, and presently into other narrow streets, until at last they stopped before a house, whereon was painted in great characters, Rowdy Journal. The Colonel, who had walked the whole way with one hand in his breast, his head occasionally wagging from side to side, and his hat thrown back upon his ears, like a man who was oppressed to inconvenience by a sense of his own greatness, led the way up a dark and dirty flight of stairs, into a room of similar character, all littered and bestrewn with odds and ends of newspapers, and other crumpled fragments, both in proof and manuscript. Behind a mangy old writing table in this apartment sat a figure with a stump of a pen in its mouth, and a great pair of scissors in its right hand, clipping and slicing at a file of Rowdy Journals, and it was such a laughable figure that Martin had some difficulty in preserving his gravity, though conscious of the close observation of Colonel Diver. The individual who sat clipping and slicing as aforesaid at the Rowdy Journals was a small young gentleman of very juvenile appearance, and unwholesomely pale in the face, partly perhaps from intense thought, but partly, there is no doubt, from the excessive use of tobacco, which he was at that moment chewing vigorously. He wore his shirt collar turned down over a black ribbon, and his lank hair, a fragile crop, was not only smoothed and parted back from his brow, that none of the poetry of his aspect might be lost, but had, here and there, been grubbed up by the roots, which accounted for his loftiest developments being somewhat pimply. He had that order of nose on which the envy of mankind has bestowed the appellation snub, and it was very much turned up at the end, as with a lofty scorn. Upon the upper lip of this young gentleman were tokens of a sandy down, so very, very smooth and scant, that, though encouraged to the utmost, it looked more like a recent trace of gingerbread than the fair promise of a moustache, and this conjecture his apparently tender age went far to strengthen. He was intent upon his work. Every time he snapped the great pair of scissors he made a corresponding motion with his jaws, which gave him a very terrible appearance. Martin was not long in determining within himself that this must be Colonel Diver's son, the hope of the family and future mainspring of the Rowdy Journal. Indeed, he had begun to say that he presumed this was the Colonel's little boy, and that it was very pleasant to see him playing at editor in all the guilelessness of childhood, when the Colonel proudly interposed and said, "My war correspondent, sir, Mr. Jefferson Brick." Martin could not help starting at this unexpected announcement, and the consciousness of the irretrievable mistake he had nearly made. Mr. Brick seemed pleased with the sensation he produced upon the stranger, and shook hands with him with an air of patronage designed to reassure him, and to let him know that there was no occasion to be frightened, for he, Brick, wouldn't hurt him. "You have heard of Jefferson Brick, I see, sir," quoth the Colonel with a smile. "England has heard of Jefferson Brick. Europe has heard of Jefferson Brick. Let me see, when did you leave England, sir?" 5 weeks ago," said Martin. 5 weeks ago," repeated the Colonel thoughtfully, as he took his seat upon the table and swung his legs. "Now let me ask you, sir, which of Mr. Brick's articles had become at that time the most obnoxious to the British Parliament and the Court of St. James's?" "Upon my word," said Martin, I have reason to know, sir," interrupted the Colonel, "that the aristocratic circles of your country quail before the name of Jefferson Brick. I should like to be informed, sir, from your lips, which of his sentiments has struck the deadliest blow." At the 100 heads of the hydra of corruption now grovelling in the dust beneath the lance of reason, and spouting up to the universal arch above us its sanguinary gore, said Mr. Brick, putting on a little blue cloth cap with a glazed front, and quoting his last article. "The libation of freedom, Brick," hinted the Colonel. "Must sometimes be quaffed in blood, Colonel," cried Brick, and when he said blood he gave the great pair of scissors a sharp snap, as if they said blood too, and were quite of his opinion. This done, they both looked at Martin, pausing for a reply. "Upon my life," said Martin, who had by this time quite recovered his usual coolness, "I can't give you any satisfactory information about it, for the truth is that I—" "Stop!" cried the Colonel, glancing sternly at his war correspondent, and giving his head one shake after every sentence. "That you never heard of Jefferson Brick, sir? That you never read Jefferson Brick, sir? That you never saw the Rowdy Journal, sir? That you never knew, sir, of its mighty influence upon the cabinets of Europe? Yes?" "That's what I was about to observe, certainly," said Martin. "Keep cool, Jefferson," said the Colonel gravely. "Don't bust. Oh, you Europeans! After that, let's have a glass of wine." So saying, he got down from the table and produced from a basket outside the door a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. "Mr. Jefferson Brick, sir," said the Colonel, filling Martin's glass and his own, and pushing the bottle to that gentleman, "will give us a sentiment." "Well, sir," cried the war correspondent, "since you have concluded to call upon me, I will respond. I will give you, sir, the Rowdy Journal and its brethren, the well of truth, whose waters are black from being composed of printer's ink, but are quite clear enough for my country to behold the shadow of her destiny reflected in." "Hear, hear!" cried the Colonel with great complacency. "There are flowery components, sir, in the language of my friend." "Very much so indeed," said Martin. "There is today's Rowdy, sir," observed the Colonel, handing him a paper. "You'll find Jefferson Brick at his usual post in the van of human civilization and moral purity." The Colonel was by this time seated on the table again. Mr. Brick also took up a position on that same piece of furniture, and they fell to drinking pretty hard. They often looked at Martin as he read the paper, and then at each other. When he laid it down, which was not until they had finished a second bottle, the Colonel asked him what he thought of it. "Why, it's horribly personal," said Martin. The Colonel seemed much flattered by this remark, and said he hoped it was. "We are independent here, sir," said Mr. Jefferson Brick. "We do as we like." "If I may judge from this specimen," returned Martin, "there must be a few thousands here, rather the reverse of independent, who do as they don't like." "Well, they yield to the popular mind of the popular instructor, sir," said the Colonel. "They rile up sometimes, but in general we have a hold upon our citizens, both in public and in private life, which is as much one of the ennobling institutions of our happy country as nigger slavery itself," suggested Mr. Brick. "Entirely so," remarked the Colonel. "Pray," said Martin, after some hesitation, "may I venture to ask, with reference to a case I observe in this paper of yours, whether the popular instructor often deals in, I am at a loss to express it without giving you offence, in forgery, in forged letters, for instance?" he pursued, for the Colonel was perfectly calm and quite at his ease. "Solemnly purporting to have been written at recent periods by living men?" "Well, sir," replied the Colonel, "it does now and then." "And the popular instructed, what do they do?" asked Martin. "Buy 'em," said the Colonel. Mr. Jefferson Brick expectorated and laughed, the former copiously, the latter approvingly. "Buy 'em by hundreds of thousands," resumed the Colonel. "We are a smart people here, and can appreciate smartness." "Is smartness American for forgery?" asked Martin. "Well," said the Colonel, "I expect it's American for a good many things that you call by other names, but you can't help yourself in Europe. We can." "And do, sometimes," thought Martin. "You help yourselves with very little ceremony, too." "At all events, whatever name we choose to employ," said the Colonel, stooping down to roll the third empty bottle into a corner after the other two, "I suppose the art of forgery was not invented here, sir?" "I suppose not," replied Martin. "Nor any other kind of smartness, I reckon?" "Invented? No, I presume not." "Well," said the Colonel, "then we got it all from the old country, and the old country's to blame for it, and not the new one. There's an end of that. Now, if Mr. Jefferson Brick and you will be so good as to clear, I'll come out last and lock the door." Rightly interpreting this as the signal for their departure, Martin walked downstairs after the war correspondent, who preceded him with great majesty. The Colonel following, they left the rowdy Journal office and walked forth into the streets, Martin feeling doubtful whether he ought to kick the Colonel for having presumed to speak to him, or whether it came within the bounds of possibility that he and his establishment could be among the boasted usages of that regenerated land. It was clear that Colonel Diver, in the security of his strong position, and in his perfect understanding of the public sentiment, cared very little what Martin or anybody else thought about him. His high-spiced wares were made to sell, and they sold, and his thousands of readers could as rationally charge their delight in filth upon him as a glutton can shift upon his cook the responsibility of his beastly excess. Nothing would have delighted the Colonel more than to be told that no such man as he could walk in high success the streets of any other country in the world, for that would only have been a logical assurance to him of the correct adaptation of his labours to the prevailing taste, and of his being strictly and peculiarly a national feature of America. They walked a mile or more along a handsome street, which the Colonel said was called Broadway, and which Mr. Jefferson Brick said whipped the universe. Turning at length into one of the numerous streets which branched from this main thoroughfare, they stopped before a rather mean-looking house with jalousie blinds to every window, a flight of steps before the green street door, a shining white ornament on the rails on either side like a petrified pineapple, polished, a little oblong plate of the same material over the knocker whereon the name of Pawkins was engraved, and 4 accidental pigs looking down the area. The Colonel knocked at this house with the air of a man who lived there, and an Irish girl popped her head out of one of the top windows to see who it was. Pending her journey downstairs, the pigs were joined by 2 or 3 friends from the next street, in company with whom they lay down sociably in the gutter. "Is the Major indoors?" inquired the Colonel as he entered. "Is it the master, sir?" returned the girl. with a hesitation which seemed to imply that they were rather flush of majors in that establishment. "The master!" said Colonel Diver, stopping short and looking round at his war correspondent. "Oh, the depressing institutions of that British Empire, Colonel," said Jefferson Brick. "Master!" "What's the matter with the word?" asked Martin. "I should hope it was never heard in our country, sir, that's all," said Jefferson Brick, "except when it is used by some degraded help, as new to the blessings of our form of government as this help is. There are no masters here." "All owners, are they?" said Martin. Mr. Jefferson Brick followed in the Rowdy Journal's footsteps without returning any answer. Martin took the same course, thinking as he went that perhaps the free and independent citizens, who in their moral elevation owned the Colonel for their master, might render better homage to the goddess Liberty in nightly dreams upon the oven of a Russian serf. End of chapter 16, part 1. Chapter 16, Part 2 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 16, Part 2. The Colonel led the way into a room at the back of the house upon the ground floor. Light and of fair dimensions, but exquisitely uncomfortable, having nothing in it but the 4 cold white walls and ceiling, a mean carpet, a dreary waste of dining table reaching from end to end, and a bewildering collection of cane-bottomed chairs. In the further region of this banqueting hall was a stove, garnished on either side with a great brass spittoon, and shaped in itself like 3 little iron barrels set up on end in a fender, and joined together on the principle of the Siamese twins. Before it, swinging himself in a rocking chair, lounged a large gentleman with his hat on, who amused himself by spitting alternately into the spittoon on the right hand of the stove and the spittoon on the left, and then working his way back again in the same order. A negro lad in a soiled white jacket was busily engaged in placing on the table 2 long rows of knives and forks, relieved at intervals by jugs of water, and as he travelled down one side of this festive board, he straightened with his dirty hands the dirtier cloth, which was all askew, and had not been removed since breakfast. The atmosphere of this room was rendered intensely hot and stifling by the stove, but being further flavoured by a sickly gush of soup from the kitchen, and by such remote suggestions of tobacco as lingered within the brazen receptacles already mentioned, it became, to a stranger's senses, almost insupportable. The gentleman in the rocking chair, having his back towards them, and being much engaged in his intellectual pastime, was not aware of their approach until the Colonel, walking up to the stove, contributed his mite towards the support of the left-hand spittoon, just as the Major, for it was the Major, bore down upon it. Major Pawkins then reserved his fire, and looking upwards said, with a peculiar air of quiet weariness, like a man who had been up all night, an air which Martin had already observed both in the Colonel and Mr. Jefferson Brick, "Well, Colonel." "Here is a gentleman from England, Major," the Colonel replied, "who has concluded to locate himself here if the amount of compensation suits him." "I am glad to see you, sir," observed the Major, shaking hands with Martin, and not moving a muscle of his face. "You are pretty bright, I hope." "Never better," said Martin. "You are never likely to be," returned the Major. "You will see the sunshine here." "I think I remember to have seen it shine at home sometimes," said Martin, smiling. "I think not," replied the Major. He said so with a stoical indifference certainly, but still in a tone of firmness which admitted of no further dispute on that point. When he had thus settled the question, he put his hat a little on one side for the greater convenience of scratching his head, and saluted Mr. Jefferson Brick with a lazy nod. Major Pawkins, a gentleman of Pennsylvanian origin, was distinguished by a very large skull and a great mass of yellow forehead. in deference to which commodities it was currently held in bar-rooms and other such places of resort that the Major was a man of huge sagacity. He was further to be known by a heavy eye and a dull, slow manner, and for being a man of that kind who, mentally speaking, requires a deal of room to turn himself in. But in trading on his stock of wisdom he invariably proceeded on the principle of putting all the goods he had, and more, into his window, and that went a great way with his constituency of admirers. It went a great way, perhaps, with Mr. Jefferson Brick, who took occasion to whisper in Martin's ear, "One of the most remarkable men in our country, sir." It must not be supposed, however, that the perpetual exhibition in the market-place of all his stock in trade for sale or hire was the Major's sole claim to a very large share of sympathy and support. He was a great politician, and the one article of his creed, in reference to all public obligations involving the good faith and integrity of his country, was "Run a moist pen slick through everything, and start fresh." This made him a patriot. In commercial affairs he was a bold speculator. In plainer words, he had a most distinguished genius for swindling, and could start a bank, or negotiate a loan, or form a land jobbing company, entailing ruin, pestilence, and death on hundreds of families, with any gifted creature in the Union. This made him an admirable man of business. He could hang about a bar-room discussing the affairs of the nation for 12 hours together, and in that time could hold forth with more intolerable dullness, chew more tobacco, smoke more tobacco, drink more rum toddy, mint julep, gin sling, and cocktail, than any private gentleman of his acquaintance. This made him an orator, and a man of the people. In a word, the Major was a rising character, and a popular character, and was in a fair way to be sent by the popular party to the State House of New York, if not in the end to Washington itself. But as a man's private prosperity does not always keep pace with his patriotic devotion to public affairs, and as fraudulent transactions have their downs as well as ups, the Major was occasionally under a cloud. Hence, just now, Mrs. Pawkins kept a boarding house, and Major Pawkins rather loafed his time away than otherwise. "You have come to visit our country, sir, at a season of great commercial depression," said the Major. "At an alarming crisis," said the Colonel. "At a period of unprecedented stagnation," said Mr. Jefferson Brick. "I am sorry to hear that," returned Martin. "It's not likely to last, I hope." Martin knew nothing about America, or he would have known perfectly well that if its individual citizens, to a man, are to be believed, it always is depressed, and always is stagnated, and always is at an alarming crisis, and never was otherwise, though as a body they are ready to make oath upon the evangelists at any hour of the day or night that it is the most thriving and prosperous of all countries on the habitable globe. "It's not likely to last, I hope," said Martin. "Well," returned the Major, "I expect we shall get along somehow, and come right in the end." "We are an elastic country," said the Rowdy Journal. "We are a young lion," said Mr. Jefferson Brick. "We have revivifying and vigorous principles within ourselves," observed the Major. "Shall we drink a bitter afore dinner, Colonel?" The Colonel assenting to this proposal with great alacrity, Major Pawkins proposed an adjournment to a neighbouring bar-room, which, as he observed, was only in the next block. He then referred Martin to Mrs. Pawkins for all particulars connected with the rate of board and lodging, and informed him that he would have the pleasure of seeing that lady at dinner, which would soon be ready, as the dinner hour was 2 o'clock, and it only wanted a quarter now. This reminded him that if the bitter were to be taken at all there was no time to lose, so he walked off without more ado, and left them to follow if they thought proper. When the Major rose from his rocking-chair before the stove, and so disturbed the hot air and balmy whiff of soup which fanned their brows, the odour of stale tobacco became so decidedly prevalent as to leave no doubt of its proceeding mainly from that gentleman's attire. Indeed, as Martin walked behind him to the bar-room, he could not help thinking that the great square Major, in his listlessness and languor, looked very much like a stale weed himself, such as might be hoed out of the public garden, with great advantage to the decent growth of that preserve, and tossed on some congenial dunghill. They encountered more weeds in the bar room, some of whom, being thirsty souls as well as dirty, were pretty stale in one sense and pretty fresh in another. Among them was a gentleman who, as Martin gathered from the conversation that took place over the bitter, started that afternoon for the far west on a 6 months' business tour, and who, as his outfit and equipment for this journey, had just such another shiny hat and just such another little pale valise as had composed the luggage of the gentleman who came from England in the Screw. They were walking back very leisurely, Martin arm in arm with Mr. Jefferson Brick, and the Major and the Colonel side by side before them, when, as they came within a house or two of the Major's residence, they heard a bell ringing violently. The instant this sound struck upon their ears, the Colonel and the Major darted off, dashed up the steps, and in at the street door, which stood ajar, like lunatics, while Mr. Jefferson Brick, detaching his arm from Martin's, made a precipitate dive in the same direction and vanished also. "Good heaven!" thought Martin, "the premises are on fire. It was an alarm bell." But there was no smoke to be seen, nor any flame, nor was there any smell of fire. As Martin faltered on the pavement, 3 more gentlemen, with horror and agitation depicted in their faces, came plunging wildly round the street corner, jostled each other on the steps, struggled for an instant, and rushed into the house, a confused heap of arms and legs. Unable to bear it any longer, Martin followed. Even in his rapid progress he was run down, thrust aside, and passed by 2 more gentlemen, stark mad, as it appeared, with fierce excitement. "Where is it?" cried Martin breathlessly to a negro whom he encountered in the passage. "In a eatin' room, sah. Colonel, sah, him kep a seat side himself, sah." "A seat!" cried Martin. "For a dinar, sah." Martin stared at him for a moment, and burst into a hearty laugh, to which the negro, out of his natural good humour and desire to please, so heartily responded that his teeth shone like a gleam of light. "You're the pleasantest fellow I have seen yet," said Martin, clapping him on the back, "and give me a better appetite than bitters." With this sentiment he walked into the dining room and slipped into a chair next the Colonel, which that gentleman, by this time nearly through his dinner, had turned down in reserve for him, with its back against the table. It was a numerous company, 18 or 20 perhaps. Of these some 5 or 6 were ladies, who sat wedged together in a little phalanx by themselves. All the knives and forks were working away at a rate that was quite alarming. Very few words were spoken, and everybody seemed to eat his utmost in self-defence, as if a famine were expected to set in before breakfast time to-morrow morning, and it had become high time to assert the first law of nature. The poultry, which may perhaps be considered to have formed the staple of the entertainment, for there was a turkey at the top, a pair of ducks at the bottom, and 2 fowls in the middle, disappeared as rapidly as if every bird had had the use of its wings and had flown in desperation down a human throat. The oysters, stewed and pickled, leaped from their capacious reservoirs and slid by scores into the mouths of the assembly. The sharpest pickles vanished, whole cucumbers at once, like sugar plums, and no man winked his eye. Great heaps of indigestible matter melted away as ice before the sun. It was a solemn and an awful thing to see. Dyspeptic individuals bolted their food in wedges, feeding not themselves, but broods of nightmares who were continually standing at livery within them. Spare men, with lank and rigid cheeks, came out unsatisfied from the destruction of heavy dishes, and glared with watchful eyes upon the pastry. What Mrs. Pawkins felt each day at dinner time is hidden from all human knowledge, but she had one comfort: it was very soon over. When the Colonel had finished his dinner, which event took place while Martin, who had sent his plate for some turkey, was waiting to begin, he asked him what he thought of the boarders, who were from all parts of the Union, and whether he would like to know any particulars concerning them. "Pray," said Martin, "who is that sickly little girl opposite with the tight round eyes? I don't see anybody here who looks like her mother, or who seems to have charge of her." "Do you mean the matron in blue, sir?" asked the Colonel with emphasis. "That is Mrs. Jefferson Brick, sir." "No, no," said Martin, "I mean the little girl, like a doll, directly opposite." "Well, sir," cried the Colonel, "that is Mrs. Jefferson Brick." Martin glanced at the Colonel's face, but he was quite serious. "Bless my soul, I suppose there will be a young Brick then, one of these days," said Martin. "There are 2 young Bricks already, sir," returned the Colonel. The matron looked so uncommonly like a child herself that Martin could not help saying as much. "Yes, sir," returned the Colonel, "but some institutions develop human nature, others retard it." "Jefferson Brick," he observed after a short silence, in commendation of his correspondent, "is one of the most remarkable men in our country, sir." This had passed almost in a whisper, for the distinguished gentleman alluded to sat on Martin's other hand. "Pray, Mr. Brick," said Martin, turning to him and asking a question more for conversation's sake than from any feeling of interest in its subject, "who is that," he was going to say young, but thought it prudent to eschew the word, "that very short gentleman yonder with the red nose?" "That is Professor Mullet, sir," replied Jefferson. "May I ask what he is professor of?" asked Martin. "Of education, sir," said Jefferson Brick. "A sort of schoolmaster, possibly?" Martin ventured to observe. "He is a man of fine moral elements, sir, and not commonly endowed," said the war correspondent. "He felt it necessary at the last election for president to repudiate and denounce his father, who voted on the wrong interest. He has since written some powerful pamphlets under the signature of Superb, or Brutus reversed. He is one of the most remarkable men in our country, sir." There seemed to be plenty of 'em, thought Martin, at any rate. Pursuing his inquiries, Martin found that there were no fewer than 4 majors present, 2 colonels, 1 general, and a captain, so that he could not help thinking how strongly officered the American militia must be, and wondering very much whether the officers commanded each other, or if they did not, where on earth the privates came from. There seemed to be no man there without a title, for those who had not attained to military honours were either doctors, professors, or reverends. 3 very hard and disagreeable gentlemen were on missions from neighbouring states, 1 on monetary affairs, 1 on political, 1 on sectarian. Among the ladies there were Mrs. Pawkins, who was very straight, bony, and silent, and a wiry-faced old damsel who held strong sentiments touching the rights of women, and had diffused the same in lectures. But the rest were strangely devoid of individual traits of character, insomuch that any one of them might have changed minds with the other, and nobody would have found it out. These, by the way, were the only members of the party who did not appear to be among the most remarkable people in the country. Several of the gentlemen got up, one by one, and walked off as they swallowed their last morsel, pausing generally by the stove for a minute or so to refresh themselves at the brass spittoons. A few sedentary characters, however, remained at table full a quarter of an hour, and did not rise until the ladies rose, when all stood up. "Where are they going?" asked Martin, in the ear of Mr. Jefferson Brick. "To their bedrooms, sir." "Is there no dessert, or other interval of conversation?" asked Martin, who was disposed to enjoy himself after his long voyage. "We are a busy people here, sir, and have no time for that," was the reply. So the ladies passed out in single file, Mr. Jefferson Brick and such other married gentlemen as were left acknowledging the departure of their other halves by a nod, and there was an end of them. Martin thought this an uncomfortable custom, but he kept his opinion to himself for the present, being anxious to hear, and inform himself by, the conversation of the busy gentlemen, who now lounged about the stove as if a great weight had been taken off their minds by the withdrawal of the other sex, and who made a plentiful use of the spittoons and their toothpicks. It was rather barren of interest, to say the truth, and the greater part of it may be summed up in one word: dollars. All their cares, hopes, joys, affections, virtues, and associations seemed to be melted down into dollars. Whatever the chance contributions that fell into the slow cauldron of their talk, they made the gruel thick and slab with dollars. Men were weighed by their dollars, measures gauged by their dollars, Life was auctioneered, appraised, put up and knocked down for its dollars. The next respectable thing to dollars was any venture having their attainment for its end. The more of that worthless ballast, honour and fair dealing, which any man cast overboard from the ship of his good name and good intent, the more ample stowage room he had for dollars. Make commerce one huge lie and mighty theft. Deface the banner of the nation for an idle rag. Pollute it star by star, and cut out stripe by stripe as from the arm of a degraded soldier. Do anything for dollars. What is a flag to them? One who rides at all hazards of limb and life in the chase of a fox will prefer to ride recklessly at most times. So it was with these gentlemen. He was the greatest patriot in their eyes who brawled the loudest, and who cared the least for decency. He was their champion who, in the brutal fury of his own pursuit, could cast no stigma upon them for the hot knavery of theirs. Thus Martin learned in the 5 minutes' straggling talk about the stove that to carry pistols into legislative assemblies, and swords in sticks, and other such peaceful toys, to seize opponents by the throat as dogs or rats might do, to bluster, bully, and overbear by personal assailment, were glowing deeds. Not thrusts and stabs at freedom, striking far deeper into her house of life than any sultan's scimitar could reach, but rare incense on her altars, having a grateful scent in patriotic nostrils, and curling upward to the seventh heaven of fame. Once or twice, when there was a pause, Martin asked such questions as naturally occurred to him, being a stranger, about the national poets, the theatre, literature, and the arts. But the information which these gentlemen were in a condition to give him on such topics did not extend beyond the effusions of such master spirits of the time as Colonel Diver, Mr. Jefferson Brick, and others, renowned, as it appeared, for excellence in the achievement of a peculiar style of broadside essay called a screamer. "We are a busy people, sir," said one of the captains, who was from the West, "and have no time for reading mere notions. We don't mind 'em if they come to us in newspapers along with almighty strong stuff of another sort, but darn your books." Here the General, who appeared to grow quite faint at the bare thought of reading anything which was neither mercantile nor political, and was not in a newspaper, inquired if any gentleman would drink some. Most of the company, considering this a very choice and seasonable idea, lounged out one by one to the bar room in the next block. Thence they probably went to their stores and counting houses, thence to the bar room again to talk once more of dollars, and enlarge their minds with the perusal and discussion of screamers, and thence each man to snore in the bosom of his own family. "Which would seem," said Martin, pursuing the current of his own thoughts, "to be the principal recreation they enjoy in common." With that he fell a musing again on dollars, demagogues, and bar rooms, debating within himself whether busy people of this class were really as busy as they claimed to be, or only had an inaptitude for social and domestic pleasure. It was a difficult question to solve, and the mere fact of its being strongly presented to his mind by all that he had seen and heard was not encouraging. He sat down at the deserted board, and becoming more and more despondent as he thought of all the uncertainties and difficulties of his precarious situation, sighed heavily. Now there had been at the dinner table a middle-aged man with a dark eye and a sunburnt face, who had attracted Martin's attention by having something very engaging and honest in the expression of his features, but of whom he could learn nothing from either of his neighbours, who seemed to consider him quite beneath their notice. He had taken no part in the conversation round the stove, nor had he gone forth with the rest. And now, when he heard Martin sigh for the third or fourth time, he interposed with some casual remark, as if he desired, without obtruding himself upon a stranger's notice, to engage him in cheerful conversation if he could. His motive was so obvious, and yet so delicately expressed, that Martin felt really grateful to him, and showed him so in the manner of his reply. "I will not ask you," said this gentleman with a smile, as he rose and moved towards him, "how you like my country, for I can quite anticipate your feeling on that point. But as I am an American, and consequently bound to begin with a question, I'll ask you how you like the Colonel." "You are so very frank," returned Martin, "that I have no hesitation in saying I don't like him at all, though I must add that I am beholden to him for his civility in bringing me here, and arranging for my stay, on pretty reasonable terms, by the way," he added, remembering that the Colonel had whispered him to that effect before going out. "Not much beholden," said the stranger dryly. "The Colonel occasionally boards packet ships, I have heard, to glean the latest information for his journal, and he occasionally brings strangers to board here, I believe, with a view to the little percentage which attaches to those good offices, and which the hostess deducts from his weekly bill. I don't offend you, I hope," he added, seeing that Martin reddened. "My dear sir," returned Martin, as they shook hands, "how is that possible? To tell you the truth, I am—" "Yes?" said the gentleman, sitting down beside him. "I am rather at a loss, since I must speak plainly," said Martin, getting the better of his hesitation, "to know how this Colonel escapes being beaten." "Well, he has been beaten once or twice," remarked the gentleman quietly. "He is one of a class of men in whom our own Franklin, so long ago as 10 years before the close of the last century, foresaw our danger and disgrace. Perhaps you don't know that Franklin, in very severe terms, published his opinion that those who were slandered by such fellows as this Colonel, having no sufficient remedy in the administration of this country's laws, or in the decent and right-minded feeling of its people, were justified in retorting on such public nuisances by means of a stout cudgel." "I was not aware of that," said Martin, "but I am very glad to know it, and I think it worthy of his memory. Especially—" Here he hesitated again. "Go on," said the other, smiling as if he knew what stuck in Martin's throat. "Especially," pursued Martin, "as I can already understand that it may have required great courage, even in his time, to write freely on any question which was not a party one in this very free country." "Some courage, no doubt," returned his new friend. "Do you think it would require any to do so now?" "Indeed I think it would, and not a little," said Martin. "You are right, so very right that I believe no satirist could breathe this air. If another Juvenal or Swift could rise up among us to morrow, he would be hunted down. If you have any knowledge of our literature, and can give me the name of any man, American born and bred, who has anatomized our follies as a people, and not as this or that party, and who has escaped the foulest and most brutal slander, the most inveterate hatred and intolerant pursuit, it will be a strange name in my ears, believe me. In some cases I could name to you, where a native writer has ventured on the most harmless and good-humoured illustrations of our vices or defects, it has been found necessary to announce that in a second edition the passage has been expunged, or altered, or explained away, or patched into praise." "And how has this been brought about?" asked Martin in dismay. "Think of what you have seen and heard to day, beginning with the Colonel," said his friend, "and ask yourself. How they came about is another question. Heaven forbid that they should be samples of the intelligence and virtue of America, but they come uppermost and in great numbers, and too often represent it. Will you walk?" There was a cordial candour in his manner, and an engaging confidence that it would not be abused, a manly bearing on his own part, and a simple reliance on the manly faith of a stranger, which Martin had never seen before. He linked his arm readily in that of the American gentleman, and they walked out together. It was perhaps to men like this, his new companion, that a traveller of honoured name, who trod those shores now nearly 40 years ago, and woke upon that soil, as many have done since, to blots and stains upon its high pretensions, which in the brightness of his distant dreams were lost to view, appealed in these words: "Oh, but for such Columbia's days were done, rank without ripeness, quickened without sun. Crude at the surface, rotten at the core, her fruits would fall before her spring were o'er." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17, Part 1 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 17. Martin enlarges his circle of acquaintance, increases his stock of wisdom, and has an excellent opportunity of comparing his own experiences with those of Lummy Ned of the Light Salisbury, as related by his friend Mr. William Simmons. Part 1. It was characteristic of Martin that all this while he had either forgotten Mark Tapley as completely as if there had been no such person in existence, or, if for a moment the figure of that gentleman rose before his mental vision, had dismissed it as something by no means of a pressing nature, which might be attended to by and by, and could wait his perfect leisure. But being now in the streets again, it occurred to him, as just coming within the bare limits of possibility, that Mr. Tapley might, in course of time, grow tired of waiting on the threshold of the rowdy Journal office. So he intimated to his new friend that if they could conveniently walk in that direction, he would be glad to get this piece of business off his mind. "And speaking of business," said Martin, "may I ask, in order that I may not be behindhand with questions either, whether your occupation holds you to this city, or, like myself, you are a visitor here?" "A visitor," replied his friend. "I was raised in the state of Massachusetts, and reside there still. My home is in a quiet country town. I am not often in these busy places, and my inclination to visit them does not increase with our better acquaintance, I assure you." "You have been abroad?" asked Martin. "Oh, yes." "And, like most people who travel, have become more than ever attached to your home and native country?" said Martin, eyeing him curiously. "To my home, yes," rejoined his friend. "To my native country, as my home, yes, also." "You imply some reservation," said Martin. "Well," returned his new friend, "if you ask me whether I came back here with a greater relish for my country's faults, with a greater fondness for those who claim, at the rate of so many dollars a day, to be her friends, with a cooler indifference to the growth of principles among us in respect of public matters and of private dealings between man and man, the advocacy of which, beyond the foul atmosphere of a criminal trial, would disgrace your own Old Bailey lawyers, why, then I answer plainly, no." "Oh," said Martin, in so exactly the same key as his friend's "no," that it sounded like an echo. "If you ask me," his companion pursued, "whether I came back here better satisfied with a state of things which broadly divides society into two classes, whereof one, the great mass, asserts a spurious independence, most miserably dependent for its mean existence on the disregard of humanizing conventionalities of manner and social custom, so that the coarser a man is, the more distinctly it shall appeal to his taste, while the other, disgusted with the low standard thus set up and made adaptable to everything, takes refuge among the graces and refinements it can bring to bear on private life, and leaves the public weal to such fortune as may betide it in the press and uproar of a general scramble, then again I answer no." And again Martin said "oh," in the same odd way as before, being anxious and disconcerted, not so much to say the truth on public grounds, as with reference to the fading prospects of domestic architecture. "In a word," resumed the other, "I do not find and cannot believe, and therefore will not allow, that we are a model of wisdom and an example to the world, and the perfection of human reason, and a great deal more to the same purpose, which you may hear any hour in the day, simply because we began our political life with two inestimable advantages." "What were they?" asked Martin. "One, that our history commenced at so late a period as to escape the ages of bloodshed and cruelty through which other nations have passed, and so had all the light of their probation and none of its darkness. The other, that we have a vast territory, and not, as yet, too many people on it. These facts considered, we have done little enough, I think." "Education?" suggested Martin faintly. "Pretty well on that head," said the other, shrugging his shoulders. "Still, no mighty matter to boast of, for old countries, and despotic countries too, have done as much, if not more, and made less noise about it. We shine out brightly in comparison with England, certainly, but hers is a very extreme case. You complimented me on my frankness, you know," he added, laughing. "Oh, I am not at all astonished at your speaking thus openly when my country is in question," returned Martin. "It is your plain speaking in reference to your own that surprises me. You will not find it a scarce quality here, I assure you. Saving among the Colonel Divers and Jefferson Bricks and Major Pawkinses, though the best of us are something like the man in Goldsmith's comedy, who wouldn't suffer anybody but himself to abuse his master. Come," he added, "let us talk of something else. You have come here on some design of improving your fortune, I dare say, and I should grieve to put you out of heart. I am some years older than you besides, and may, on a few trivial points, advise you, perhaps." There was not the least curiosity or impertinence in the manner of this offer, which was open-hearted, unaffected, and good-natured. As it was next to impossible that he should not have his confidence awakened by a deportment so prepossessing and kind, Martin plainly stated what had brought him into those parts, and even made the very difficult avowal that he was poor. He did not say how poor, it must be admitted, rather throwing off the declaration with an air which might have implied that he had money enough for 6 months instead of as many weeks. But poor he said he was, and grateful he said he would be for any counsel that his friend would give him. It would not have been very difficult for any one to see, but it was particularly easy for Martin, whose perceptions were sharpened by his circumstances, to discern, that the stranger's face grew infinitely longer as the domestic architecture project was developed. Nor, although he made a great effort to be as encouraging as possible, could he prevent his head from shaking once, involuntarily, as if it said in the vulgar tongue upon its own account, "No go." But he spoke in a cheerful tone, and said that although there was no such opening as Martin wished in that city, he would make it matter of immediate consideration and inquiry where one was most likely to exist, and then he made Martin acquainted with his name, which was Bevan, and with his profession, which was physic, though he seldom or never practised, and with other circumstances connected with himself and family, which fully occupied the time until they reached the Rowdy Journal office. Mr. Tapley appeared to be taking his ease on the landing of the first floor, for sounds as of some gentleman established in that region whistling Rule Britannia with all his might and main greeted their ears before they reached the house. On ascending to the spot from whence this music proceeded, they found him recumbent in the midst of a fortification of luggage, apparently performing his national anthem for the gratification of a grey-haired black man, who sat on one of the outworks, a portmanteau, staring intently at Mark, while Mark, with his head reclining on his hand, returned the compliment in a thoughtful manner, and whistled all the time. He seemed to have recently dined, for his knife, a case bottle, and certain broken meats in a handkerchief lay near at hand. He had employed a portion of his leisure in the decoration of the Rowdy Journal door, whereon his own initials now appeared, in letters nearly half a foot long, together with the day of the month in smaller type, the whole surrounded by an ornamental border and looking very fresh and bold. "I was a'most afraid you was lost, sir," cried Mark, rising, and stopping the tune at that point where Britons generally are supposed to declare, when it is whistled, that they never, never, never— "Nothing gone wrong, I hope, sir?" "No, Mark. Where's your friend?" "The mad woman, sir?" said Mr. Tapley. "Oh, she's all right, sir." "Did she find her husband?" "Yes, sir. Leastways, she's found his remains," said Mark, correcting himself. "The man's not dead, I hope?" "Not altogether dead, sir," returned Mark, "but he's had more fevers and agues than is quite reconcilable with being alive. When she didn't see him a-waiting for her, I thought she'd have died herself, I did." "Was he not here, then?" "He wasn't here. There was a feeble old shadow come a-creeping down at last, as much like his substance when she knowed him as your shadow, when it's drawn out to its very finest and longest by the sun, is like you. But it was his remains, there's no doubt about that. She took on with joy, poor thing, as much as if it had been all of him." Had he bought land? Asked Mr. Bevan. Ah, he'd bought land, said Mark, shaking his head, and paid for it too. Every sort of natural advantage was connected with it, the agent said, and there certainly was one, quite unlimited, no end of the water. "It's a thing he couldn't have done without, I suppose," observed Martin peevishly. "Certainly not, sir. There it was, anyway. Always turned on and no water rate. Independent of 3 or 4 slimy old rivers close by, it varied on the farm from 4 to 6 foot deep in the dry season. He couldn't say how deep it was in the rainy time, for he never had anything long enough to sound it with." "Is this true?" asked Martin of his companion. "Extremely probable," he answered. "Some Mississippi or Missouri lot, I dare say." "However," pursued Mark, "he came from I don't know where and all, down to New York here to meet his wife and children, and they started off again in a steamboat this blessed afternoon, as happy to be along with each other as if they were going to heaven. I should think they was pretty straight, if I may judge from the poor man's looks." "And may I ask," said Martin, glancing, but not with any displeasure from Mark, to the negro, "who this gentleman is? Another friend of yours?" "Why, sir," returned Mark, taking him aside and speaking confidentially in his ear, "he's a man of colour, sir." "Do you take me for a blind man?" asked Martin, somewhat impatiently, "that you think it necessary to tell me that, when his face is the blackest that ever was seen?" "No, no. When I say a man of colour," returned Mark, "I mean that he's been one of them as there's pictures of in the shops. A man and a brother, you know, sir," said Mr. Tapley, favouring his master with a significant indication of the figures so often represented in tracts and cheap prints. "A slave?" cried Martin in a whisper. "Ah," said Mark in the same tone, "nothing else. A slave. Why, when that there man was young, don't look at him while I'm a-telling it, he was shot in the leg, gashed in the arm, scored in his live limbs like crimped fish, beaten out of shape, had his neck galled with an iron collar, and wore iron rings upon his wrists and ankles. The marks are on him to this day. When I was having my dinner just now, he stripped off his coat and took away my appetite." "Is this true?" asked Martin of his friend, who stood beside them. "I have no reason to doubt it," he answered, shaking his head. "It very often is." "Bless you," said Mark, "I know it is, from hearing his whole story. That master died. So did his second master, from having his head cut open with a hatchet by another slave, who, when he'd done it, went and drowned himself. Then he got a better one. In years and years he saved up a little money and bought his freedom, which he got pretty cheap at last, on account of his strength being nearly gone, and he being ill. Then he come here, and now he's a saving up to treat himself, afore he dies, to one small purchase. It's nothing to speak of, only his own daughter, that's all," cried Mr. Tapley, becoming excited. "Liberty for ever! Hurrah! Hail Columbia!" "Hush!" cried Martin, clapping his hand upon his mouth, "and don't be an idiot. What is he doing here?" "Waiting to take our luggage off upon a truck," said Mark. "He'd have come for it by and by, but I engaged him for a very reasonable charge, out of my own pocket, to sit along with me and make me jolly, and I am jolly, and if I was rich enough to contract with him to wait upon me once a day to be looked at, I'd never be anything else." The fact may cause a solemn impeachment of Mark's veracity, but it must be admitted, nevertheless, that there was that in his face and manner at the moment which militated strongly against this emphatic declaration of his state of mind. "Lord love you, sir," he added, "they're so fond of liberty in this part of the globe, that they buy her and sell her and carry her to market with them. They've such a passion for liberty that they can't help taking liberties with her. That's what it's owing to." "Very well," said Martin, wishing to change the theme. "Having come to that conclusion, Mark, perhaps you'll attend to me. The place to which the luggage is to go is printed on this card: Mrs. Pawkins's boarding house." "Mrs. Pawkins's boarding house," repeated Mark. "Now, Cicero." "Is that his name?" asked Martin. "That's his name, sir," rejoined Mark; and the negro, grinning assent from under a leathern portmanteau, than which his own face was many shades deeper, hobbled downstairs with his portion of their worldly goods, Mark Tapley having already gone before with his share. Martin and his friend followed them to the door below, and were about to pursue their walk, when the latter stopped and asked with some hesitation whether that young man was to be trusted. "Mark? Oh, certainly, with anything." "You don't understand me. I think he had better go with us. He is an honest fellow, and speaks his mind so very plainly." "Why, the fact is," said Martin, smiling, "that being unaccustomed to a free republic, he is used to do so." "I think he had better go with us," returned the other. "He may get into some trouble otherwise. This is not a slave state, but I am ashamed to say that a spirit of tolerance is not so common anywhere in these latitudes as the form. We are not remarkable for behaving very temperately to each other when we differ, but to strangers! No, I really think he had better go with us." Martin called to him immediately to be of their party, so Cicero and the truck went one way, and they three went another. They walked about the city for 2 or 3 hours, seeing it from the best points of view, and pausing in the principal streets, and before such public buildings as Mr. Bevan pointed out. Night then coming on apace, Martin proposed that they should adjourn to Mrs. Pawkins's establishment for coffee. But in this he was overruled by his new acquaintance, who seemed to have set his heart on carrying him, though it were only for an hour, to the house of a friend of his who lived hard by. Feeling, however disinclined he was, being weary, that it would be in bad taste and not very gracious to object that he was unintroduced, when this open-hearted gentleman was so ready to be his sponsor, Martin, for once in his life at all events, sacrificed his own will and pleasure to the wishes of another, and consented with a fair grace. So travelling had done him that much good already. Mr. Bevan knocked at the door of a very neat house of moderate size, from the parlour windows of which lights were shining brightly into the now dark street. It was quickly opened by a man with such a thoroughly Irish face that it seemed as if he ought, as a matter of right and principle, to be in rags, and could have no sort of business to be looking cheerfully at anybody out of a whole suit of clothes. Commending Mark to the care of this phenomenon, for such he may be said to have been in Martin's eyes, Mr. Bevan led the way into the room which had shed its cheerfulness upon the street, to whose occupants he introduced Mr. Chuzzlewit as a gentleman from England, whose acquaintance he had recently had the pleasure to make. They gave him welcome in all courtesy and politeness, and in less than 5 minutes' time he found himself sitting very much at his ease by the fireside, and becoming vastly well acquainted with the whole family. There were 2 young ladies, one 18, the other 20, both very slender but very pretty. Their mother, who looked, as Martin thought, much older and more faded than she ought to have looked, and their grandmother, a little sharp-eyed, quick old woman, who seemed to have got past that stage, and to have come all right again. Besides these, there were the young lady's father, and the young lady's brother, the first engaged in mercantile affairs, the second a student at college, both in a certain cordiality of manner, like his own friend, and not unlike him in face. Which was no great wonder, for it soon appeared that he was their near relation. Martin could not help tracing the family pedigree from the 2 young ladies, because they were foremost in his thoughts, not only from being, as aforesaid, very pretty, but by reason of their wearing miraculously small shoes and the thinnest possible silk stockings, the which their rocking chairs developed to a distracting extent. There is no doubt that it was a monstrous comfortable circumstance to be sitting in a snug, well-furnished room, warmed by a cheerful fire, and full of various pleasant decorations, including 4 small shoes and the like amount of silk stockings, and, yes, why not, the feet and legs therein enshrined. And there is no doubt that Martin was monstrous well disposed to regard his position in that light, after his recent experience of the screw and of Mrs. Pawkins's boarding house. The consequence was that he made himself very agreeable indeed, and by the time the tea and coffee arrived, with sweet preserves and cunning tea cakes in its train, was in a highly genial state, and much esteemed by the whole family. Another delightful circumstance turned up before the first cup of tea was drunk. The whole family had been in England. There was a pleasant thing. But Martin was not quite so glad of this when he found that they knew all the great dukes, lords, viscounts, marquesses, duchesses, knights, and baronets quite affectionately, and were, beyond everything, interested in the least particular concerning them. However, when they asked after the wearer of this or that coronet, and said, "Was he quite well?" Martin answered, "Yes, oh yes, never better." And when they said, "His lordship's mother, the Duchess, was she much changed?" Martin said, "Oh dear no, they would know her anywhere if they saw her to morrow," and so got on pretty well. In like manner, when the young ladies questioned him touching the gold fish in that Grecian fountain in such and such a nobleman's conservatory, and whether there were as many as there used to be, he gravely reported, after mature consideration, that there must be at least twice as many. And as to the exotics, oh well, it was of no use talking about them. They must be seen to be believed. Which improved state of circumstances reminded the family of the splendour of that brilliant festival, comprehending the whole British peerage and court calendar, to which they were specially invited, and which indeed had been partly given in their honour, and recollections of what Mr. Norris the father had said to the Marquess, and of what Mrs. Norris the mother had said to the Marchioness, and of what the Marquess and Marchioness had both said, when they said that upon their words and honours they wished Mr. Norris the father, and Mrs. Norris the mother, and the Misses Norris the daughters, and Mr. Norris junior the son, would only take up their permanent residence in England, and give them the pleasure of their everlasting friendship, occupied a very considerable time. Martin thought it rather strange and in some sort inconsistent that during the whole of these narrations, and in the very meridian of their enjoyment thereof, both Mr. Norris the father and Mr. Norris junior the son, who corresponded every post with 4 members of the English peerage, enlarged upon the inestimable advantage of having no such arbitrary distinctions in that enlightened land, where there were no noblemen but nature's noblemen, and where all society was based on one broad level of brotherly love and natural equality. Indeed, Mr. Norris the father, gradually expanding into an oration on this swelling theme, was becoming tedious, when Mr. Bevan diverted his thoughts by happening to make some causal inquiry relative to the occupier of the next house; in reply to which this same Mr. Norris the father observed that that person entertained religious opinions of which he couldn't approve, and therefore he hadn't the honour of knowing the gentleman. Mrs. Norris the mother added another reason of her own, the same in effect, but varying in words, to wit, that she believed the people were well enough in their way, but they were not genteel. Another little trait came out which impressed itself on Martin forcibly. Mr. Bevan told them about Mark and the negro, and then it appeared that all the Norrises were abolitionists. It was a great relief to hear this, and Martin was so much encouraged on finding himself in such company that he expressed his sympathy with the oppressed and wretched blacks. Now, one of the young ladies, the prettiest and most delicate, was mightily amused at the earnestness with which he spoke, and on his craving leave to ask her why, was quite unable for a time to speak for laughing. As soon, however, as she could, she told him that the negroes were such a funny people, so excessively ludicrous in their manners and appearance, that it was wholly impossible for those who knew them well to associate any serious ideas with such a very absurd part of the creation. Mr. Norris the father, and Mrs. Norris the mother, and Miss Norris the sister, and Mr. Norris junior the brother, and even Mrs. Norris senior the grandmother, were all of this opinion, and laid it down as an absolute matter of fact, as if there were nothing in suffering and slavery grim enough to cast a solemn air on any human animal, though it were as ridiculous physically as the most grotesque of apes, or morally as the mildest Nimrod among tuft-hunting republicans. In short, said Mr. Norris the father, settling the question comfortably, there is a natural antipathy between the races. Extending, said Martin's friend in a low voice, to the cruellest of tortures and the bargain and sale of unborn generations. Mr. Norris the son said nothing, but he made a wry face, and dusted his fingers as Hamlet might after getting rid of Yorick's skull, just as though he had that moment touched a negro and some of the black had come off upon his hands. In order that their talk might fall again into its former pleasant channel, Martin dropped the subject, with a shrewd suspicion that it would be a dangerous theme to revive under the best of circumstances, and again addressed himself to the young ladies, who were very gorgeously attired in very beautiful colours, and had every article of dress on the same extensive scale as the little shoes and the thin silk stockings. This suggested to him that they were great proficients in the French fashions, which soon turned out to be the case; for though their information appeared to be none of the newest, it was very extensive, and the eldest sister in particular, who was distinguished by a talent for metaphysics, the laws of hydraulic pressure, and the rights of human kind, had a novel way of combining these acquirements and bringing them to bear on any subject from millinery to the millennium, both inclusive, which was at once improving and remarkable; so much so, in short, that it was usually observed to reduce foreigners to a state of temporary insanity in 5 minutes. Chapter 17.